Good morning. Good morning, everybody, or could be afternoon actually, or it could indeed be evening, because I think we have a lot of attendees from different parts of the world. So welcome to our webinar on how to reduce the risk of phishing and ransomware. So a lot of interesting content to get through today. But before I go through the agenda of what we're actually going to cover, some boring housekeeping rules just to help you participate in the event and enjoy the event as well. So the first thing is where your interaction panel is, and that should be on the top right of your screen. And if you look there, you'll see that one of the drop-down options is the audio panel. Now, most people will have joined this session through the computer audio, but you can, if you have any access problems or internet problems, you can also join by clicking on the audio panel and then selecting the phone option, and that will show you the dial-in details in case you do have any computer problems. Separate to that then, just to run through how we're going to take questions. So you'll see that there's also a questions panel within your control panel. You can submit questions at any time throughout the session. We will actually, we'll wait till the end to answer all those questions, but do feel free to submit them at any time. You'll also see that underneath the questions panel, there's also a handouts panel. And if you click on that now, you'll see that there's actually a copy of the presentation that we're running through today. So you can absolutely download that at any point of the session. And then there's also a poll session. So you'll see that there should be 2 polls there. So throughout the presentation, Michael and Sean will be doing 2 polls. So you can participate in those polls by clicking on that poll section. So I think that's it now for the housekeeping information that we needed to go through. So just moving on to the agenda. So yeah, so in terms of what we're going to cover today, so the first part, just introductions, so briefly introducing you to myself and my colleagues. Then Michael is going to go through the research, so the research on phishing and ransomware, what the findings were from the survey that they conducted. And then my colleague Sean is going to go through some additional insights from his experience with TitanHQ. And then at the end, once we've gone through all the detail, then we'll take all the questions that we've been asked. And if there's any, if we don't get enough time to go through all those questions, we will respond to each question individually via email. So I think that's it for me. So I'm going to actually hand you, the introduction. Sorry, guys. So the introduction. So I'm Catherine. I'm the new Customer Success Director at TitanHQ. So I'm only here just over 3 months now, but customer success is just something that we're putting a huge focus on within TitanHQ. So we've just set up the customer success department. I'm joined by my colleague Sean Morris, who is our Chief Technical Officer, who's with TitanHQ a little bit longer than me. And then Michael Sampson, who is a Senior Analyst from Osterman Research, and he's going to go through the main research findings today. So I will hand you over to Michael now.
Thanks, Catherine. Good to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to talk through some of the findings that we got from our recent research project on phishing and ransomware and how to protect yourselves and against that, and how to reduce the risk of being compromised by that. The research was run earlier in the year, and we did a survey with 130 people. The respondents had to be in a cybersecurity role in their organization, and also had to be familiar with how phishing and ransomware were managed from a technological and organizational perspective inside their firm. We were looking for mid and large size organizations, and across the 130 people that responded to the survey, the average number of employees across the respondent organizations was slightly over 17,000. We did not put an industry requirement on the respondents, so respondents from any industry were welcome to participate and take part in the survey. Let's look through some of the key findings that we found in the survey. But before we do that, we're going to run a poll at this point. So this is the first poll. Has your organization been the victim of a ransomware attack? We have a yes, a no, or an unsure, and this will be up for about 30 seconds, and then we're going to have a look at the results from our audience today. and then we'll have a look through some of the results that came from the survey itself. So, have you been the victim of a ransomware attack? Yes, no, or unsure? Okay, so here's the results. 65% are no, 32% are yes, we have, and 3% are unsure. Two-thirds are no. Okay, well that's a good outcome. I hope that for the two-thirds that have not been the victim, that we can keep that number like that and increase that over time, and definitely as a consequence of some of the ideas that we'll be talking through today. Right, let's go to the first finding that we had from the research. So there were 17 threat types that we asked about across the organizations. These are the top 7 that over half said that they had high effectiveness in protecting endpoints from malware infection. 76% said they had high effectiveness in the ability to prevent that from happening. Protecting end users from ransomware, 66% said they were highly effective, 34% said they were less so. We've got some other issues here like protecting the integrity of backups against ransomware infection, training end users on detecting and addressing phishing and other social engineering attacks, and so on in this list here. The next 10 flipped the result set. So rather than half saying we're highly effective, now we have half or over half saying we don't have that high effectiveness. And so these are the big issues that organizations need to be aware of. If we start at the bottom of the list, securing employees' home infrastructure and preventing it from being a conduit for cyber attacks into the corporate network, 72% of respondents said that this is an issue for them. And with the pivot to working from home last year as a consequence of the health pandemic and the likelihood of that continuing through the hybrid workforce model, this becomes quite an issue for organizations to deal with. The second from the bottom, preventing mobile devices from being a conduit for cyber attacks. 63% said that this was an issue of significant concern for them, and so on. And you can see the others here. The slides are available, so I won't talk through all of the issues in here. And there's also a white paper that Osterman wrote that TitanHQ sponsored, and I'm sure that there will be some way for you to get a copy of that after this from the TitanHQ website. So you can see all of these results in here at your leisure. When we looked at the data on effectiveness against threats, and again there were 17 threats overall, only half of the respondents said that they were highly effective against the threats that they faced. So overall, half said yes, we've got high effectiveness, and half said no, we have low effectiveness. When I then split the data out to try and look for some patterns in terms of, if someone's good at doing this, are they also good at doing this? And are they also good at doing this? We found that 37% of respondents were highly effective against 11 or more threat types. So given the plethora and the spread of attack quadrants in phishing and ransomware, the ability to have high effectiveness across as many of those as possible is an important outcome for organizations to reach for. Another one of the questions that we asked in the survey was how many incidents or of the various types of incidents that we asked about, how many of these had happened in the previous 12 months. Only 16% of the respondents said that none of the incidents that we asked about had taken place. Slightly over half said that they had faced 1 to 3 of the types, and 30% said that they had faced 4 or more of the types of the incidents that we asked about. This is the list of the top 5 incidents, and there were more that we asked about, and there's more that's in the white paper. I'm not going to talk through all of those today, but here's the top 5 that we had. So a business email compromise attack against a lower level employee, 53% of respondents said that this is something that had happened in their organization. A malware infection as a consequence of a phishing attack, 49% of respondents said that this is something that had happened in their organization over the previous 12 months. Phishing resulting in account compromise, 47% said that this is an issue that had happened in their organization. And there are a couple of others here on this slide, and there are more in the report itself. But with only 16% saying none of these things happened based on the optics that we have available for us, and it could be a lower number, it could only be 5% actually, but 16% believed that based on the optics they had, that these attacks had not happened. We're seeing a widespread of attack types successfully landing in organizations around the world. We asked about issues of high concern for the cybersecurity professionals who were the focus of this survey. 65% said that phishing attempts received by end users was an issue of high concern to them. Employees falling for attacks was an issue of high concern to 64%. There are 2 ransomware issues that were of high concern to 61% and 59% of respondents respectively, and then a 0-day threat infection to 56%. This survey was run in 2019 as well, and when I looked back at the data points from the 2019 survey, in comparison, the 2 issues around phishing and employees falling for attacks had declined in importance, or in terms of how much concern people put on it. That's the right way to say it. The ransomware issues, which in this survey are 61 and 59, had increased in terms of the levels of high concern that people were experiencing. And definitely with some of the attacks that we've seen this year after our report came out, the Colonial Pipeline one, for example, the Irish Health Service. I'm from New Zealand, and there was a district health board down here that was also breached by ransomware. Those issues, plus the ongoing scale of ransomware across the world, this is an issue that is becoming increasingly of high concern to cybersecurity professionals. Phishing is a complicated beast, and when I looked at the antecedents or the things that lead through to phishing being such a significant issue, and phishing itself has a variety of ways of appearing, either as just plain phishing or spear phishing or some of the others that are listed here. You can see that there's quite a number of issues across people, information, systems, and process that make phishing a dangerous and complex thing that needs to be dealt with. From an information perspective, very often messages don't carry a malicious payload, so our ability to detect malware in a message and therefore block it is not a pathway that we have available when a phishing message doesn't have anything like that. Some of the systems issues that we have would include things like extreme volumes of spam, that as that increases, we're seeing cyber threat actors using spam as a way of delivering phishing messages to people. From a process perspective, 2020 was an unprecedented year for the world in recent history at least, and so some of the issues that we have around the ability to turn to the person next to you and say, have a look at this, when you're sitting in an office, we're suddenly taken away when everyone's distributed and remote and sitting out at their home office, and those historical or common ways of checking things are now not possible. And then from a people perspective, social engineering tricks that are included in phishing messages can be very persuasive and can be made to look as though it's just a normal thing and it's something that we've already been doing, and the tricks are good at tricking people. And there are others here that I won't talk through. In terms of the outcomes of phishing, there's a series of those, from malware infection. For example, if someone clicks on a link in a phishing email and then visits a web page, malware can be downloaded and installed on their machine. That could also be a ransomware foothold for a cyber threat actor inside an organization. It could simply just be credential theft. And if multi-factor authentication is not being used, the theft of an individual's username and password to a trusted system then gives a cyber threat actor the ability to pretend to be them and access and exfiltrate data that belongs to the corporation. And we also see phishing attacks being used for financial sabotage in the form of invoice attacks, where someone sends an invoice through pretending to be from a vendor, or sends an email through saying, hey, I'm from this vendor, we've just changed bank account, could you please pay current invoices into this? And definitely over the last year or so, we've seen financial sabotage numbers in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per incident, and sometimes in the millions of dollars per incident. And the loss of that money can have a significant impact on an organization where the person in accounts payable just believes they're being responsive to a vendor and are doing the right thing, but actually have been tricked. In the survey, we asked about the confidence that cyber security professionals had in terms of the ability of these groups of employees, managers, and executives to recognize phishing attempts both by email and through other channels. So other channels would be things like social media or LinkedIn. You can see here that in general, there was a higher level of confidence that all employee types were better trained to recognize phishing attempts by email than through other channels. And therefore, one of the takeaways from this is that if a cyber threat actor wanted to increase phishing activity against a particular target, using and compromising channels other than email would be a good way of seeking to get a foothold. We also see that overall these numbers are not as high as they should be. Now, if executives are targeted for financial sabotage and only 60% of them are able to recognize those attempts, that creates quite a degree of vulnerability in processes that can then be attacked through an email channel. Another one of the questions that we asked in the survey was around the effectiveness of phishing mitigations. We didn't just want to know what people were finding in terms of where we're at and the types of attacks that they were experiencing, but we wanted to be able to leverage the expertise and experience of the 130 people that responded to this to say, when you've looked at your organization and the threats that you're facing, what have you found to be most effective as a way of mitigating those threats? 74% said that the use of multi-factor authentication to reduce the ease of stealing usable credentials was the most effective mitigation that they had come across. And while multi-factor authentication is not foolproof, and we have seen attacks that have bypassed multi-factor authentication methods, anyone that is not using multi-factor authentication is only asking for problems. Second key mitigation here was training employees to recognize common phishing lures. There's this idea that humans are a line of defense, and having a healthy degree of skepticism to look at something that apparently comes from someone that you've dealt with and go, that doesn't quite look right. I need to ring them and ask, or I need to ask someone else to have a look at this, or I need to escalate through to my IT group and say, can you have a look at this and just let me know if this works? That's a very important line of defense for organizations. From a technological perspective, issue number 3 here at 62% as well was the ability to remove suspicious phishing messages from multiple mailboxes, that once the IT department or the security department or the SecOps team had seen that there was a particular phishing message that had come into the organization, the ability to then extract that and get rid of it so that further employees would not see it was a good mitigation to reduce the scope of attack and threat against the organization. And you can see the other ones here that we have noted, including the use of AI and machine learning, and also the base DNS controls such as SPF, DKIM, and DMARC to increase the email authentication infrastructure that's in place and reduce the impersonation threats and some of the other technical ways of manipulating how we do commerce on the internet. The survey also talked about and focused on ransomware as a threat. I don't have a pretty diagram for the antecedents for ransomware, but issues like remote desktop compromise, phishing messages, as we've talked about already, malvertising, the compromise of advertising capabilities and networks to slip in malicious ads that then link to malicious sites or give a drive-by download. Software updates that have been compromised is something that we saw definitely in the WannaCry era back in 2017, or a compromised password as a result of a data breach or a password dump or any of the other approaches that are in the wild for guessing or breaking someone's password. All of these lead to, or can be used to lead through to a ransomware infection. We're seeing some cyber threat gangs take a very precise approach to the timing of attacks in order to increase the leverage against the attacked organization in order to secure a payment. Things like attacks that happen at midnight on the day before Christmas, or attacks that happen just as a school district is about to begin its classes for the new year. When that happens, the organization is put definitely under the spotlight to determine how they are going to respond to that. And we've also seen over the last couple of years the use of multi-level extortion. No longer is it we've encrypted your data, now pay us to decrypt it. We've now got things like we've stolen your data, pay us to not release it, and oh, by the way, we've also encrypted your systems. Or we've stolen your data, and if you don't pay us, we're then going to auction it off to other people so that they can access your intellectual property. There's multiple levels of extortion that are coming in to increase the likelihood that a cyber gang will actually receive a payment. Outcomes of ransomware kind of gets worse the longer that a ransomware attack or the seeds of a ransomware attack remain in place undetected in an organization, from initial infection and compromise through to lateral movement and seeking to establish persistence where further systems are compromised and further ransomware seeds are planted across the organization, through to things like operational disruption. You know, when a hospital system is suddenly unable to deal with the influx of patients and has to revert to pen and paper, or ask patients coming in for appointments to bring their medical histories with them, which they probably don't have because they are supposed to be securely stored in the hospital systems. All of that creates a significant operational disruption and sometimes even loss of life as a consequence of the appropriate surgical interventions not being appropriate or not being available. And in some cases, we've even seen cessation of business operations where an organization cannot recover from a ransomware attack and goes out of business. Like we asked the survey respondents to address the confidence to recognize phishing attacks, we also asked around the confidence to recognize ransomware attacks. I don't have a comparative slide showing here, but in general, the ability or the confidence to recognize ransomware attacks is lower across the majority of these employee groups than it was to recognize phishing attacks. Let's get that right. So the group that has the highest ability to recognize ransomware attacks were mid-level managers, followed by executives. The group with the least level of confidence was new employees. So there's a training and an onboarding process that's required to help new employees to the organization get up to speed. We also asked about the effectiveness of ransomware mitigations, as we had with phishing. Multi-factor authentication to reduce the ease of stealing usable credentials also came out in first place, with 78% of respondents saying that this was a highly effective strategy for them. Rapidly patching system and application vulnerabilities was in second place, with 64% of respondents. Once a vendor releases an advisory that a particular system or application is vulnerable, cyber criminals are paying attention to that as well, and will often seek to release a compromising toolkit to attack those systems before organizations are able to do anything about it. We saw that recently with a file sharing system out of America, where the vendor in question acknowledged that there was a vulnerability and released a patch within 72 hours. But in that 72-hour window, 50 of the customers that used that tool were compromised by a cyber gang using that vulnerability. We've got the training issue here in number 3, training employees to recognize common ransomware tricks. It's interesting if we look at the very last issue here, cyber insurance cover for ransomware payouts. It's effective in only 14% of cases. And I guess there's the sense of, while it might deal with the immediate problem and that you can pay the money and then get back to business, if you don't actually then address the weaknesses that you have, it's likely that the cyber gang will just come calling next week, or another cyber gang will go, hey, these guys just paid $1 million or €1 million. Let's go and attack them now because we've seen that they have weaknesses, and let's see if we can compromise that as well. So is cyber insurance cover a good idea? Yeah, it probably is. Will it reduce the risk of ransomware overall? No, not really, but something that you should still be looking at. We asked about issues of high concern with ransomware, and I've split 6 of those across a concern around prevention and then a concern around recovery. 61%, and this was the top ranked issue of high concern, was around breaching corporate data. And from a European perspective, with the introduction of GDPR and the data protection mandates in that, and from an American perspective, with newly emerging regional approaches to data protection like CCPA and CPRA in California, and some of the others in the other states don't quite have a federal approach to this yet. The breaching of corporate data, the theft of intellectual property, the exfiltration of customer details that then results in breach notifications and fines and all of that. This was the most significant issue from a prevention point of view. The infecting of endpoints was an issue for 59% of respondents, preventing 0 days at 56%, and keeping patching current. Those were the 4 top ranked issues from a prevention point of view. From a recovery perspective, after a ransomware attack, 54% said negative brand effects was a significant issue for them. And then half of the respondents said just the base ability to recover data and systems after a ransomware attack and get back to standard operations was an issue of high concern to them. This is my second to last slide. We asked about the 3-year change in ability to deal with a range of threats. And overall, the picture is not bad, it's pretty good. For most of these issues, at least half of the respondents said that there is an improving situation in the ability to deal with things like, if you have a look at this number 2, our ability to support remote and home workers at 69%. And clearly with the health pandemic and people suddenly having to pivot to work from home, that's become an issue that's very much moved up the priority list. And from the responses to the survey, it looks as though that focus on that has been good. Phishing attacks reaching end users via email, 75% said that this is an improving area. So we would interpret that as the ability to prevent phishing attacks from reaching end users. Better technology, better way of detecting phishing even when a compromised or malicious payload is not there for being detected. There are also some concerns with this slide. The ability to recover completely from a ransomware infection, 48% said we've had no change or it's got worse over the last 3 years. And as we've seen ransomware increasing as a vector of attack and double, triple, quadruple extortion approaches being used, the standing still with this, while cyber gangs are definitely not standing still, is an issue of concern and risk for organizations. Phishing attacks against third parties using domain spoofing, 52% said we have no change or it's got worse in the last 3 years. And again, as those types of attacks are increasingly used, standing still is not a good approach. So several conclusions from the report, and clearly in the time that we've had available today, I haven't gone through everything in the survey or all of the mitigations that are available, but TitanHQ do have a copy of the report available and you'll be able to get that. But here are some conclusions for today. Phishing and ransomware are increasingly problematic. We see the use of these for data exfiltration, double, triple, or quadruple, or even more extortion levels, and operational damage that can last weeks or months, or even put an organization out of business if the attack is significant. We've seen increasingly impactful attacks, the Colonial Pipeline attack in May that disrupted a huge percentage of the fuel availability on the east coast of the United States. The Irish Health Service, I don't have that one here, I don't have it here, but there's also, as I said, a health organization down here in New Zealand that's still struggling to deal with a ransomware attack that happened around the same time as the Irish Health one. And overall, doing nothing is a bad approach. It's increasingly problematic, it's increasingly impactful, and standing still is not an appropriate strategy for an organization. So we would encourage organizations to review, assess, strengthen, and introduce increased and elevated protections around phishing and ransomware. I think at this point we're going to go to Sean, and he's going to share some insights and ideas from a TitanHQ viewpoint.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you, Michael, and thanks for sharing a fantastic update and all those wonderful and frankly sometimes quite scary insights. I suppose, as Catherine mentioned earlier, my name is Sean Morris. I'm the CTO here at TitanHQ. I thought it would be good to share some insights on how we, as a cybersecurity company, protect ourselves and our customers, and what's our framework, how we think about these things, and what are the best practices we're focused on right now. And I'll wrap up with my own thoughts on, I guess, the 5 pillars of prevention for ransomware and phishing attacks, before handing back to Catherine and moving on to some Q&A. So I guess maybe moving on to the next slide, I suppose the first question is, so how does TitanHQ protect its business, right? And really good question. One, as a CTO, I have to ask myself practically every day. A lot of it ultimately comes down to common sense, being well informed, a holistic approach. Certainly those are key drivers, combined with, I think, a degree of paranoia. And I only say that half jokingly. I think that it's good to be incredibly vigilant and to think long and hard about the real impacts that this that bad actors can have on your business. So our approach really focuses on leveraging the best practices of the industry, and there's a lot of great thought out there, and it's best to build on that. And thinking about things in terms of a layered defense model. So as pictured here, we really look at it holistically across all the potential layers and combine this together really to give us the best possible outcomes. So maybe just to talk through this sort of briefly. So what are our layers of defense? Obviously, we start with the human layer, which certainly factored heavily in Michael's update there. When people are trained to spot dodgy or suspect emails and generally engage in other best practices around securing, their devices, etc., it goes an awful long way. It really does, and the vigilance that you can instill in people is a great first layer of defense. The network, there is so much that can be done here. We leverage our own products, obviously SpamTitan and WebTitan, to actively protect against phishing emails and to prevent staff going to malware sites. But we employ also a broad suite of tools in addition to this, in terms of dealing with naturally firewall, IDS, IPS, SIM, and vulnerability scanning. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Endpoints, critical part of your infrastructure, the devices that people use, particularly. We leverage, things like Microsoft Defender and a lot of tools to scan our devices, manage what applications are installed, and ensure that we're addressing vulnerabilities that invariably appear in that sphere. And all our devices are, Azure joined from a management perspective and scanned regularly. So really managing the application footprint that appears on devices, managing what users can put in there, and managing the versions of those to be the most up-to-date versions are kind of, a bit of motherhood and apple pie, but fundamental to your sort of security posture and reducing your attack surface. Moving on from that, applications. As a business, we now mainly leverage SaaS products, and we leverage multi-factor authentication across virtually everything at this point. Again, it's just the most fantastic way to really limit any potential impact from password-related issues. And again, more to say on that in a moment. As we're getting to the center of these concentric circles, we're getting into the kind of the areas that are of perhaps most interest to the least desirable people in this industry, the bad actors, right? Your data and your mission critical assets, right? Often very much the same thing depending on the business you're in. From our perspective, as I think only just referenced by Michael as well, data is heavily regulated. It's really important to have your arms around that and the impacts. It's not just the EU, it's many jurisdictions now. So we really leverage a suite of tools and strategies here. We obviously leverage TitanHQ, our own product, from an email perspective. Microsoft have many fantastic offerings in this space, in terms of OneDrive from a day-to-day perspective for protection and ransomware protection. But we also leverage AWS from a critical data protection perspective. I'll talk a bit about how we do that in more detail in a minute. So, I suppose, getting into the mission critical aspect of this, we as a company really sat down and thought long and hard about what we can do that would make it exceptionally difficult for things like critical data backups to be compromised. These things that represent the crown jewels of our business, in our case, our product code, our customer data, they're just fundamental. And I think to the point that was made earlier, whilst there are many different and often multiply employed ransomware tactics that can be used, in some respects, if you're at that point, perhaps the most important thing becomes how fast can you reinstate your business to full operation, right? And a fully integral, full integrity backup that hasn't been compromised is a fantastic tool if employed correctly to bring you up to back into business quickly. And that's where often some of the larger losses for companies can occur, the being out of business part of it. So that's where we focus, and we've definitely made some specific investments and changes in process there to ensure that that's the case. So with that, this might be a good time to move on to our second poll question. And I guess having just talked through those layers, I'm interested in your thoughts on which layers of security are you most focused on right now in your organization? Is it the human layer, network and endpoint, applications, data, or your critical assets? So we're just going to give everyone a few seconds to mull that over and offer up your selections before we close out the poll. Okay, so not surprisingly, network and endpoint, because I think that's where a lot of the action is. It's great to see human getting quite a bit of attention as well, application and data. I think critical assets, perhaps an opportunity then for more to consider what to do when everything else has failed. Are you ready to deal with that worst case scenario? So certainly some really interesting views from that poll. So I guess moving on to some best practices, right? So what are the best practices we think about now? I guess I should make the point that we're, as a business, in operation in the cybersecurity space for over 20 years. So we're building off of a wonderful institutionalized set of best practices as an organization. And in some respects, we build on that. We build on that on a day-to-day basis to ensure that we're moving forward and with that vigilance in mind, really enhancing and improving how we deal with security on a day-to-day basis. So a couple of things that I suppose have been, more front of mind for us as an organization in recent times. Business continuity planning, right? Which, it's the fundamental for any business. I would hope that everyone's giving this some thought. But it's a wonderful tool to bring attention to the specific threat of ransomware and phishing, right? And the implications for your company. We run this type of threat exercise biannually. We actually run a ransomware scenario and related types of scenarios for our own business. It's a great way to really flush out potential areas of weakness. We involve our full senior team, so the CEO, all directs, and anyone that's got a role to play is involved. It drives awareness into every part of the organization at a leadership level and across all teams, and keeps cybersecurity at the top of the agenda. I would say, as an aside, we also manage the outputs of those exercises into an organizational risk register. And as good as and as great as the exercises are, because the very fact that you're living a simulated ransom attack is quite a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people. There's an additional aspect to that, which is building the discipline to see through the findings that appear in those conversations and ensure that they get remedied. Phishing training has been highlighted here previously by Michael, and I'm sure you've all heard about this before. But from our perspective, we're a big believer in the human layer. In fact, as a company, because we have to, we're a cybersecurity company, one would hope that we're all incredibly well versed, but you can't take it for granted, right? So we run campaigns every 2 weeks without fail across our entire organization. We train every new hire quickly when they come in the door, because we're very aware of that new person kind of maybe distracted, maybe unaware, maybe there's some sort of, I don't know, confidence thing or something. Who knows what the psychology is, but we don't want that to become an actual threat vector. So, when you come in the door, you get trained pretty much immediately, and emphasize how important it is. So bring the vigilance to bear. We report the results, to our own senior management and to the board of the company. And I think, although everyone here is probably pretty familiar with the mechanisms and benefits of simulated phishing and training, even our head of security actually follows up with anyone who does click an email, whenever that has happened, to re-emphasize the importance of this. Now, a final point I'd make here is that it's great to benchmark, and this is a great place to benchmark. Look at the size of your organization, look at the industry you're in. You can find those benchmarks out there. We have a benchmark target based on our industry and organization size of 2.8%. I actually consider that way too high. And our most recent 2-week campaign came in at 0 clicks. So nobody clicked any of the emails that went to all of our employees. So that's the benchmark we're aiming for and continue to push for, which is to make certain we're as watertight in this space. Another one to just call out, cloud first. Controversial perhaps for some people because there's differing views even still in the industry on cloud versus on-prem. But I personally firmly believe that agility, the agility that cloud and using cloud and SaaS related solutions brings is a key enabler to better cybersecurity. In some respects, it's also the beginning of a journey to a full zero trust model. And for those of you who read around the space, you'll know that that's the coming framework really to further enhance cybersecurity in any enterprise. I mean, a very simple example, the pandemic, I mean, it's driven enormous changes in work practices, as we all know. A lot of things like, remote or hybrid working are now essentially established as new norms, right? But when we think about the architectures that we've grown up with in the industry, like a castle with a moat and secret passages, or enterprise network essentially with a firewall and VPNs, they don't make so much sense anymore. Many of the products you now use are SaaS. Most of your staff are working somewhere other than inside the traditional office. And VPN technology, just to pick on that specific aspect, has been implicated in many breaches recently in the last few years. SonicWall, NordVPN, PulseSecure, just to name a few. So I guess what I'm really saying here is that starting to think about cloud first and how to simplify your network infrastructure generally with that in mind is a great way to get to better results in the space over time. Continuous learning. It's a cliche, but the reality is that we are in a business that changes fast. It's a fast evolving environment, both the technology and the threats. We already talked about investing in your staff generally through the training and security awareness, but the frontline staff, the people who drive your technology and security agenda, investing in them heavily is something that will pay back greatly in dividends, and it's a lot cheaper than ransomware. They're being ransomed by cyber criminals, right? The certifications and training that they get, it's a great education. It opens you up and them up to new and better options to secure your business. I suppose ultimately reduce your attack surface. But perhaps the most important thing I can say on this is that when they come back from training, listen to them, because they will have learned something and you may well have to take action on that. And that's going to be a kind of a key step in the process from your perspective. So final couple of points on this. I mentioned the Microsoft ecosystem here. We are pretty big fans of that. It's pretty much a standard across the industry. M365 at this stage, I would say it's quite common. And I've included it here because I think probably a lot of you, if not all of you, are already using it. There are lots of potential features in there to add into your layered defense model. I mean, we leverage Azure Active Directory and Azure Joint Devices, which are a phenomenal approach for cloud-first organizations. We use OneDrive for all our day-to-day company file storage, and that includes a great ransomware protection capability, which if you haven't already deployed, is well worth putting into play. We have all our mobile devices on Intune for MDM, and Intune itself, the baseline security policies are brilliant and are updated regularly by Microsoft. So lots to leverage there, more than I can call out today. And the final item I mentioned, MFA, it's already been said many times. We'll say it again and again and again. It's just a wonderful, albeit occasionally inconvenient initially when you're changing, but when we think about the kind of the whole world of authentication and the mechanisms associated, a basic username and password model, it's just so susceptible to business email compromise. There are now literally billions of passwords in circulation and password email credential combinations. I mean, even in the last month, one of the largest ever password compilations was released, 8.4 billion passwords included in that. So, the reality of password fatigue, because we have so many passwords, we have so many accounts, both private to our personal, to ourselves and public, and the unfortunate reality that often there's cross-pollination of passwords between those things. It's without MFA, you are heavily exposed in this environment, so I can't emphasize that enough. So those are our best practices. I think I'm going to wrap up now with just a kind of a brief recap on some of what I think are maybe the 5 pillars of protection to prevent ransomware and phishing attacks, right? So, so I suppose there's a lot that you can do in this space. I think certainly going back over Michael's research closely would be something I would recommend, independent of all of this. In reality, I'm going to echo many of the things that he's just said anyway, right? But if I was to boil it down to 5 things, I would say certainly the first thing to do is to think about scanning your inbound email. It's a predominant channel for phishing attack, and it would be remiss of me not to highlight that Spam Titan is really a fantastic solution in this space. It's a great way to get your email threat level under control. Equally, checking what's going on with your web traffic outbound from your staff, avoiding and catching any traffic to malicious links. Web Titan is an awesome solution in that regard as well. And both tools employ a wide variety of best-in-breed techniques, including machine learning and live threat feeds to mitigate your risks here. And as I mentioned before, scanning and managing your devices for vulnerabilities is a very important practice and shouldn't be ignored. That's, again, something we place huge emphasis upon as an ongoing activity. Patch it. It's a bit harder to protect against zero-day exploits, but as referenced earlier, many cyber criminals find it far easier just to exploit the vulnerabilities in software that have not been kept up to date, right? The window only has to be small. So ensuring you patch your system quickly and comprehensively is a great way to take out a major risk vector for your business. Train those people that are in your organization. I suppose in one sense, it occurred to me, just like phishing training, repetition is key. So I'm repeating this again and again and again on the hope that it will sink in for all of you. But the benefits of phishing training and campaigns are absolutely huge and a great bang for the buck when combined with all of the things we discussed already. And MFA is a fantastic way to stop the potential for business email compromise. That benefits around stopping fraud and identity theft, phenomenal from a compliance perspective, because data exfiltration often immediately follows these type of breaches. And it safeguards against that sort of password fatigue concept that I mentioned earlier, where the reality is that people often just rely on the same password over and over again, and that's a huge risk. And I think the final one, I mentioned with the backup, and I wanted to just talk about this in a little bit more detail. So backing it up, lots of different ways to do this, and obviously the best approach here is to leverage multiple approaches in parallel. But I would say that a secure encrypted backup of those critical data assets that has an air gap, really, and there are many ways to achieve that, alternate media, alternate providers and/or accounts, but generally something that's inaccessible from your network and from your users is the best way to guarantee that ability to restart your business quickly. The business downtime is a really huge impact in terms of the cost of a ransomware attack. And perhaps the other thing I would point out here is that backups are great, but they must be tested and tested regularly. If you do not regularly attempt from a disaster recovery perspective to restore and confirm that the desired business outcome is achieved with that backup, it may not be what you hope it is, and unfortunately you'll find out at the worst possible time how good or bad your process really is. Better to know in advance and to constantly improve and course correct, and of course deal with any errors that might have crept into your process over time as well. So those are my 5 pillars, and I guess with that I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention, and I'd like to hand you back to Catherine.
Thanks, Sean. Really, really interesting. So we have about 4 minutes to go through some questions, and lots and lots coming in here. So let's see if I can do a good job of picking the interesting ones. So Sean, this might be one for you. Because ransomware attacks are so lucrative, do you think they can ever be prevented?
That's a great question, Catherine. I guess we can make it harder and harder, right? I think that's the goal of all of us in this industry, is to make it harder and harder for them to happen. It's hard to fundamentally prevent these, though, for a number of reasons. One could argue the geopolitical landscape is a factor, in that you've got some extremely well-heeled nation state or nation state sponsored actors that are at play here. And that is, you know, a fairly daunting adversary to have, right? I think another much more prevalent issue is the reality of legacy technology, right? So small companies and large battle with the reality of, you know, older technology, its implicit value to their business, the difficulties of replacing it, the cost, you know, the business disruption, and put it off. And it becomes part of the cybersecurity threat for their organization as a result, and that is another big factor. You know, while cybersecurity insurance was mentioned as a kind of I suppose, a mitigation, but it's actually in all likelihood encouraging more attacks, because I mean, I guess not to put ideas out there, like, but if you were to hack an insurer that provides cybersecurity insurance, you get a great list of people that you could subsequently go after, and who could probably pay the bill, right? So there's things to consider there. I think as long as technology continues to evolve, so will the threats, and as long as there's value in it for criminals, they're going to keep trying to do this. On the long term, I think the very best hope is a major paradigm shift. So something extremely disruptive, like, you know, quantum computing, that might drive a sea change in encryption, or some other aspect of that. If that can be brought to bear, that might be the thing that brings this whole thing to heel. But at the moment, I don't see it in the near term.
Fingers crossed. Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think there's a difference between, can ransomware attacks be prevented completely, and can we make our organization less attractive? And I think at this stage, the answer to the first question is no, we can't prevent them completely yet, but we can make our organizations less attractive as a target, and therefore other organizations more attractive. That sounds a little bit bad to say it that way, but you know, I think from an organizational perspective, we're trying to reduce as many risks as we can. The other comment that I'd just add, Sean, you mentioned cyber insurance, and I mentioned it too, but the other thing that I didn't say during the earlier part, but I think it's called out in the report, is one of the reasons that cyber insurance is a good idea is that in order to qualify for it, there's quite a process that an organization has to go through in terms of, do you have this defense approach in place? Do you have this approach in place? And the more no's that you say to those things, the higher your premium gets. And so it's, in some ways, it's like an external assessment of your security posture and your position, that where there's a financial benefit to you actually putting in some of these issues. It's like a last line of you know, defense from a financial perspective, but it also can be an early line of defense in terms of uplifting your own capabilities.
Sure. Sorry, I'm just looking at the time, folks, and it's actually it's on the hour now, so we don't actually have the time to go through any more questions. I have actually kept a record of all of them, so anything that anybody's asked, we will respond to individually. So yes, that brings us to the end of our webinar. So just to let you know that you will receive a survey on your exit. So if you could provide us with feedback, we'd really, really appreciate it. You'll also receive an email within the next 48 hours, and that will have the recording of this session in it. So yeah, hopefully you found it worthwhile, and thanks so much for your engagement, and hopefully we'll see you on one of our webinars in the not too distant future. So yeah, have a great day, everybody.